Hello everybody and welcome to our first rundown of summoners. We're going to be doing this weekly show to give you guys some tips and tricks and teach you all about summoners and how it works and all sorts of other nifty little tricks like that. This series will be our new series. We'll be doing it weekly. You'll hear and see posters about it soon, but hopefully you guys enjoy this and get a lot out of it because there's a lot to summoners that people miss, and hopefully we can give you a nice little rundown of the cards. So the basics: your magic, monster and chakras, all of which can be found in the starter decks. Monsters and magic can be gathered from the booster decks. Now my first tip is when you're creating a summoners deck is to always get boosters. The booster packs contain a lot of switches, a lot of maneuverability cards that can give you an upper hand as well as really good defense. A good summoners deck is a mix of aggression and defense. You don't want to go too hard because then once you're put into a corner, you won't be able to back yourself out, as some people who have recently played the games have found out. One of the best sort of bits of advice I can give on the deck building side of things, is you want to get at least a starter deck and 2 boosters. That's the best starting point when it comes to building a summoner's deck. You also want to build on how often these cards will show up. Now summoners doesn't have a minimum, but it does have a maximum when it comes to decks. So you can have a maximum of 72 cards, but you can have 0 minimum. Now that doesn't mean you want to have nothing but high ranking cards in your deck, because if you become predictable, your opponents will easily be able to rock around you. So I suggest maybe having a deck of about 30-40 cards is a really nice happy medium when it comes to deck building. Let's talk a bit about the monsters. So as we know, with all our monster cards, we have our different chakras, our different elements and our different gems. As a reminder to everybody, the top gem is your aggressive gem, which allows you to have 2 attacks, but the monster needs only to be attacked once to be destroyed. Your evasive gem, the first 2 attacks will miss, the third will hit, and only then can the monster be defeated. The blue gem, the monster needs to be attacked twice, the attack once. So even the evasive gem is also only 1 single attack. The trick here is in the evasive stance. The evasive stance, the first 2 attacks are going to miss. So that means you can use a low ranking monster to get the 2 misses out of the way, and then bring in a second monster to get the 3rd hit. This is the best way around evasive if you can't switch the cards around. Defense is another good one to have. Because defense requires your monster to be attacked twice, you can actually kill off creatures pretty quickly because the first hit requires them to actually make contact. So if you're able to switch your card in the last second, you can kill off a lot of monsters with that little maneuverability. The next stage we're going to talk about is that exact maneuver, which is switching at the last second. Summoners is a game about strategy and about thought and making things clear and simple. So when somebody declares an attack, it's very important for you to clarify that they have declared their attack. Once they've done this, you can then use your cards appropriately. If you haven't locked in an attack, then your opponent can back out of that initial engagement and save their monster. And vice versa, if you don't declare your attack, you can possibly save your monster. So, an example. I have my unicorn and my leviathan. The leviathan has an aggressive gem of 8 and the unicorn has an aggressive gem of 4. So in this scenario, the leviathan's going to win. However, the leviathan has an evasive of 3. So if I can switch this, I can actually kill the leviathan if I get it into evasive stance. The leviathan also has a high defense, so I can't switch it into that either because the unicorn won't be able to defeat it. But we'll talk about two different approaches from this scenario. From the unicorn's player perspective, the Leviathan's a big threat because it can kill you in 2 of your 3 stances. So your best bet is to either get the Leviathan to drop below your number or to boost yourself. If the Leviathan declares their attack, so in this scenario, the Leviathan has 8, is in aggressive, so it's going to attack twice. Once you clarify, is your Leviathan attacking, then they go, yes, my Leviathan is attacking the unicorn, that's when you can activate your magic cards. If you activate a magic card that allows your unicorn to go into evasive at the last second, then that means the first 2 attacks on the Leviathan are going to miss, and you'll save your unicorn. The next thing is elemental switching, which is it's a sneaky trick that not a lot of people implement. I honestly thought it would be a bit more popular than it is, but we'll see. So there's certain cards that allow you to change the elements. In this scenario, my unicorn has a weakness to red. If the Leviathan player declares their attack, yes, my Leviathan is attacking your unicorn, then you can activate this at the last second, making your unicorn go out of phase, and the Leviathan's attack completely null and void. So this is a great way to avoid super high powerful monsters, as well as sneaking around your opponent. It also depends on a little bit of luck having those in hand, but that's also why the element cards are there. The element cards are there for you to get an upper hand over your opponent, not just in the last minute, but also to make your own maneuverability a lot simpler. Another good strategy that people like to employ is called forced elemental. So in this scenario, we'll say that the unicorn player has 2 Oni, a unicorn, a kraken, and I only have my Leviathan. What I want to do in this scenario is actually target just the crake, because if I leave these ones all out on the field, they all share the same weakness. So even though I'm at a monster disadvantage, if I can eliminate the crake out of the fight, now my opponent is stuck in an elemental lock. So this means that even though they have a monster advantage, if they can't kill my card, then the next turn I can play an elemental card. Where is it? I can play this card, having all of these cards go out of phase, and I can go straight into the chakra. So having elemental cards on hand is good, but it's also nifty to pay attention to your opponent's elemental cards, because you can get them into little traps like this. So we'll talk about common misconceptions, because that's another thing that pops up a lot in Summoners games. Monsters can bleed attacks over onto others. So for example, we have my Leviathan. We'll play from the other person's perspective. I have my Leviathan, my Crake, my Unicorn, and my 2 Oni. Now, the Leviathan has 8. None of these monsters are capable of overcoming the Leviathan. So I need to use 2 monsters to attack the Leviathan, and I'm naturally going to sacrifice one of these. I've come to terms that one, if not both, will die. Both of these monsters are at 7, so the Leviathan can only kill one of them, but I'm still going to lose that monster. However, I can get around this by using the elements to my advantage. If I can activate an elemental advantage, I might only be able to sacrifice one by boosting one of their statistics. But in this scenario, if I attack the Leviathan with both of these, even though there's 4 attacks and I only need the 1 to destroy the Leviathan, the attacks cannot bleed over. These monsters are dedicated to attacking this Leviathan. So these 2 will be out even if I only needed the 1 successful attack. A lot of people, the common misconception is that the number of attacks are a total. So for example, the Oni will attack twice and that'll be 7 plus 7. but it's not. It's 2 attacks at 7. So the Leviathan is still 8, and therefore, even though there's 2 attacks, it's not going to overcome the Leviathan. So you need to use 2 monsters, or you need to force the Leviathan into a different rotation, or even knock it out of phase before you can bypass it. Another misconception is with the chakras. Some people have come to calling it attacking with your chakras. So it's very common, especially at this stage in the game, for the chakras to grant you an extra attack. So in this scenario, we've got the blue chakra. When the energy dice matches, it grants the user an extra attack. This extra attack is not a bonus attack like on its own. It needs to be attached to a monster. So the monster itself gets an extra attack, not necessarily the chakra. So that means if one of your monsters has 2 attacks and is able to overcome its opponent and it has the chakra, it cannot then fire into the chakra and wiping it out, because this attack, the Leviathan has already dedicated all of its attacks to one monster hand. You can, however, split between monsters. By splitting between monsters, we'll bring back our Oni. The Leviathan, if the Leviathan has 3 attacks, right, it can direct all of these attacks at one of the Oni. However, in the reverse situation, the Oni, you can give one of them 3 attacks, and if the Oni dies in the process and the other one has the 3rd attack, it can aid in its approach, if that makes any sense. It's a lot easier to understand these concepts when you actually try them out in a game. You've got to think of it as the monsters can only dedicate themselves to a single task. So that's either attacking another monster or attacking a chakra directly. If the monster's wiped out and it still has extra attacks, it's already attacked the monster specifically, so it cannot go for the chakra. The monsters can either attack something or they can do nothing, and that's their 2 sort of ins and outs. So you need to think of it on that level of things. Let's talk about deck building. So a lot of people like to focus on cards that are high, so such as the Leviathan, the Oni, the Unicorn, various other stuff, aspects like that. And a lot of the cards are overlooked, like Shieldcrake or the Grillis. The Grillis is actually a perfect example. If you do not have a Grillis in your deck, it might be handy to get one, because these guys are fantastic little suicide bombers. So what you do with a Grillis is, if you can have, it's even more effective if you have a card that allows you to switch into the Grillis's element. But they're a little bit risky because you have to hope that their element shows up. But a Grillis is very easy to defeat, and that's the point of it. If you can get the element it requires to be in play and then get the Grillis defeated, then you can use the Grillis to wipe out multiple monsters at once. A good monster deck has a balance of cards. Cards that can not only defend you, but cards that can be tempting. So for example, if you play a Manticore along with your Unicorn, so the Unicorn has a evasive stance of 7 and is typically played in evasive stance. That's its strong suit. The Manticore has got a 5, 4 and a 6. It's an average sort of card when it comes to overall output, but its purpose is meant to be misdirection. So you can play your Manticore in evasive or fence, doesn't really matter. Evasive if you're on the defense. And the point of your Manticore is to direct attention away from your Unicorn. If you place a lot of weaker monsters around stronger ones, your opponent's more likely to try and thin the herd than they are to focus onto your larger creature. But vice versa, if you see somebody doing this, they're trying to misdirect you from their bigger creature. The little creatures themselves are there to enhance the larger ones. So in this scenario, I could use my Manticore's 2 attacks to weaken anybody on the field and then use my unicorn's powerful 7 to wipe out a monster. But vice versa, if people attack me, they're more likely to go for my manticore and not my unicorn, allowing my unicorn to wreak more havoc. If you want to counter this, is to eliminate the unicorn and then eliminate all the other weaker monsters around it. The only problem is doing mass monster murder is a little bit more difficult if you don't have the powerful cards with you. So it is a little bit of a gamble, but this scenario works tremendously. You got to remember that Summoners is not just about luck, it's a hell of a lot more about strategy, and being able to manipulate your opponent into attacking the monsters you want them to attack will allow you to create a much stronger defense, because you don't lose points for having monsters eliminated, but you want them to waste their attacks on the monsters that are weaker because they're not going to serve you as much. But by having those weaker monsters, it allows you to clear a path for your much larger, stronger and scarier monsters. Let's talk about Magic. Magic decks are very difficult because it comes down to how you prefer to play. So some people like to be aggressive, some people like to be defensive, and some people like to be a little bit of a mix. There's pros and cons to all of these, obviously. If you want to play aggressively, then what you want to do is you want to build yourself up with a lot of spell cancels. You want to build yourself up with a lot of spell force damages, and you're going to want a lot of dismiss and summon cards. If you build your Magic deck around these will allow you to create a very powerful offensive strategy, because what this does is it allows you to boost your monsters when necessary, cancel your opponent's counter spells, as well as dismissing monsters to give yourself the monster advantage, as well as summoning monsters to give you a monster advantage, all of which is very important. Now, the summon and desummon spells are more commonly found in booster packs, and that's why getting boosters is so important, because these two spell cards can give you a massive upper hand. A really good strategy, if you're a little bit lucky, is both dismissing and summoning on the exact same turn. So if you're able to dismiss a summon and then summon yourself, that's huge. One of the best ways to win a summoner's game, and one of the most common ways to win the summoner's game, is to obtain the monster advantage. And that's really what you're playing for most of the time. You want to be able to have at least 2 monsters up on your opponent. So, an example. In this scenario, I'm actually I do not have a monster advantage. Just because I have 4 cards does not mean I have a monster advantage at all. Eliminating a card and losing a card to the elements is very common. So in this scenario, I do not have a monster advantage. Being at least 2 monsters up is what's going to give you the monster advantage. This is the situation that you want to get yourself into. If a element goes the wrong way and one of your monsters goes out of phase, you're still up a monster. If your opponent is able to desummon, you're still up a monster. This is what's called being in the monster advantage. And actually in this scenario, you have a monster advantage of 1. So not a monster advantage of 2, even though it's 4-2, you have a monster advantage of 1, because it means that you can lose 1 monster and still have the advantage. If you're only 1 card up, you do not have a monster advantage at all. A lot of your opponents and a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that they have an advantage in this state, but what you can really do is you can sort of play to that. If your opponent has got more monsters than you can lure them into accidentally sacrificing and then bringing them down to 2, in which case If you have the same amount of monsters as your opponent, you're completely in dead heat. This is not... Neither one of these opponents has the upper hand. Even if the other opponent has stronger monsters, 2-on-2 is still 2-on-2. And if the elements are not in your favor, then you're going to be in for a rude awakening, depending on who's in this situation. So I really, what the difference between your magic moves, what is and is not effective, is what I like to call wasting spells. So for example, using a spell reversal card on a elemental switch is not going to help you. Using a dismissed card in their turn is also not going to help you, not necessarily. So in this situation, a reverse card, which is this, allows the last spell that was played to be played as if you were to play it. So if you use that on an elemental switch, it doesn't mean anything. If you try and play one of these, it still technically works, but you reveal to your opponent that you have a switch, and they can lure you into a false sense, a false trap in order to use that spell. So let's talk a little bit about the chakras, because a lot of people overlook them. Your chakra cards are your backups. There are different versions of chakras that can be found in the starter kits as well as the special editions, and none of them can be found in boosters. So the only way to obtain more chakra cards is to obtain more starters. But basically your chakras give you a extra bonus attack and defense. So what you can do with these is you need to remember that they're there. A lot of people will play a monster card. So in this scenario, we'll use my Leviathan and my Rainbow Serpent. In this scenario, I have 2 attacks, but I need 3 to defeat the Kraken. Most people think, well, I don't have that, but you can use your chakra to obtain that extra 3rd attack that you're required to take out a monster. So it's important to remember your chakras, but it's important to collect your chakras. So there's a plethora of chakras available that will shield you in certain elemental situations, allow you extra attacks, or even dismiss attacks. So working out what you want to build is very vital. But actually, let's double back to the building of the decks. So let's talk about building an aggressive deck. To build an aggressive deck, you're going to want to have a lot of sacrificial monsters as well as a lot of high strength monsters. So your sacrificial monsters are going to want to be things like the Chimera, which is a 6/6/6 all round, because this puts your opponent into a strange state, because 6 is both low that it's manageable, but it's high enough that it's a threat. So having a monster with multiple 6s is very handy. Having a lot of high strength monsters, such as the Leviathan, is also handy, as well as a lot of high defensive monsters like the Hippocampus, which is high evasive, equally as handy. So when you're building an aggressive deck, you want to always keep your opponents on the defensive. So this means you want to have a lot of spells that give you force damage, a lot of spells that cancel to stop your opponents from wiggling out of your pressure. The opposite is true for your defensive decks. So with your defensive decks, you want to focus more on monsters with high evasive and monsters with evasive. You're not necessarily going for damage, you're going for the long con. You're going to try and obtain the monster advantage. So if you're doing a defensive deck, you want some high evasive monsters so that you can build a wall that's difficult to topple. With your spells, you want a lot of elemental switches, you want a lot of position switching. So the problem with defensive decks, because you're banking on having high evasive, is your opponents will probably have high aggressive monsters, which means you will have difficulty getting around them because you don't have the strength necessarily to topple them. So that's why you want to have a lot of spells that switch your monsters. So let's talk about the 2 different magics for both versions of the game. So Your defensive spells are your elemental switching. Let me put these down here. And your chakra awakenings, as well as your dismissing of monsters. What's the difference between defensive and evasive? Good question. So defensive monsters require to be hit, and your evasive monsters have the 2 attacks that miss. So with your high defensive monsters, so monsters that have a high defense, actually have to be hit first. And so you can get them to sacrifice a lot of monsters trying to take down a defensive monster. So for example, I'll try and find 2 monsters that give us a good play. Here we go. So a Minotaur and another Chimera. In this situation, I have a Chimera in defensive, and he's going up against a Minotaur and another Chimera. So both of these Chimera have got an aggressive gem of 6, and the Minotaur has an aggressive gem of 6. But my Chimera has a defensive gem of 6. Now, you have to remember the specific wording that we have for these. A defensive monster is hit twice. So this means that if the Chimera attacks, even though it has got 2, it will be eliminated on the first because it's 6. So you actually have to use both of these monsters to take down the Chimera. You need 2 hits of 6. Again, it's important to remember that with the gems, it actually comes down to hitting and missing. If it's a hit, then it comes down to gem on gem contact. So in this situation, the Chimera hits the other Chimera. The difference is this one requires 2 hits to be eliminated. This one has got 2 hits, but it's destroyed upon the first because 6 and 6 evens out. But this monster still hasn't met the criteria to be destroyed yet. You need to have another monster come in to give you the second hit of 6 in order to eliminate it. So your defensive gems are for that exact purpose. A defensive gem needs to be hit twice. And so you can lure your opponents into a false sense of security, or you can do a switch at the end to get that damage in. The evasive side of things, the first 2 attacks miss and the third is a hit. So this means that in this scenario, if the Chimera attacks, its 2 attacks go through, both miss, and the Chimera is fine because both missed. And then the Minotaur comes in, the third hit kills both because both of them are 6. So I'll go over that again just to make it a little bit more clearer because it is a fantastic question. The difference between evasive and defense is the wording. The defense monster needs to be hit twice. The evasive monster will miss twice, and then the third hit will kill them. So again, in this scenario, both of these monsters, all the monsters on the field share the same number. They all have 6. My defensive monster has a defensive gem of 6. My attacking monsters both have aggressive gems of 6. They both get to attack twice, but since they're both 6, the first one will eliminate itself upon contact, and the second one will be the last hit. So it's a very, very good question. And high defensive monsters are relatively rare. The highest in defense you can find in the game, I believe, is a 7. And 7 and 6 are sort of your high-end defensive monsters. Most monsters have a relatively low evasive, around 5 and 6. And most monsters have a high aggressive, being 5 and 6. A few monsters have got 7 and 8. So your 7 and 8 monsters typically have a really weak other gem, so make it 3 or 2 in some situations. So you need to build your decks appropriately and focus on what you want to get out of your monsters and understand the difference and weaknesses of your monsters. So back onto our deck building with our magic. By being aggressive, you want to have a lot of force damage multipliers to defeat that very situation that we were in. Force damage is a fantastic aggressive spell, especially if you're using it to boost up a lot of your low monsters for attacks. So a good example is if you can get a few of these into your hand and a few of your monsters, your sacrificial monsters, as well as your big monster on the field, you will be able to boost all of your lower ranking monsters into a higher damage in order to really overwhelm your opponent. And that's the big difference between the two play styles. If you're going to be aggressive, you need to keep your opponent on the fence. You want to stop them from wiggling out of spells, and you want them to summon monsters that are going to naturally meet their demise, and you want to be able to bypass those monsters with relative ease. With defense, it's the same situation but in reverse. You want high defensive and high evasive monsters. High evasive monsters are anything that's a 5 and a 6, because that will give you a more widespread sort of coverage. It's we'll have to do a few examples, I believe. So in a scenario here, we'll talk about being an aggressive player and we'll talk about being a defensive player. So an aggressive player would have a lot of Krakens, Leviathans, and should Kraken's somewhat aggressive? Let's go with a Chimera. So you want to have monsters that are around, your high powered monsters sit at 8, and your sacrificial monsters sit at around 6 and 5. That's a really good aggressive deck, because these monsters are your cannon fodder. They're there to weaken your evasive counters, and they're also there to blow themselves up on things. Leviathans are extra special because a Leviathan, if it is defeated, it can do 8 damage to another creature on the field. So Leviathans are actually giant sacrificial ships. So if you have a Leviathan on the field and you're being countered, let's say by another Kraken, let's do a little bit of a field test here. Here we go. This is actually a fantastic scenario. So let's say that I have an opponent who has both a Kraken and a Leviathan. I have a Leviathan and a Chimera. There's a few different ways around this, but as an aggressive player, I want to keep the pressure on them hard. So for me, by playing a spell that allows me to go into the red, or even being lucky enough to get the red, will allow my Leviathan to activate its special ability, which means when it's defeated, it gets to attack again. So I would sacrifice my Leviathan onto their Kraken, and then, because both of these monsters kill each other, I would then wipe out their Leviathan as well, taking one with me. Now, this is a terrible situation because both players have Leviathans, because they will also be allowed to take an extra monster, so it evens itself out. But if you have two high ranking monsters, sacrificing one card for 2, always a good idea. Maybe not if they've got a Leviathan as well. Now let's talk defensively. Your defensive monsters, again, the Chimera is a fantastic defensive monster. Same with your Minotaurs and your Hippocampus, Crake, and to be honest, the Leviathan's not a bad defensive monster as well. And that wouldn't hurt having extra damage on your side either way. So all of these monsters have either got high evasive or high defense. These are all perfect for a defensive deck because they all have what I like to call baits. So, a good example is the Crake. The Crake has got a 6 aggressive gem, a 7 defensive gem, and a 4 evasive gem. What you would do is you would play the Crake in evasive because it's its lowest gem. This is the bait. because it's got a 4, people believe that you're playing defensively and they're going for it. And you are playing defensively. You're baiting them in to sacrifice themselves on your wall. So, when someone comes in to destroy your crake at the last minute, you force your crake into defensive stance. This requires 2 hits at 7. So, that means even a unicorn who has an evasive of 7 still will kill itself trying to defeat the crake. So you want to be able to constantly switch your monsters into each other. There are more cards allowing you to switch a monster into defensive stance. So doing this bait is a really good switch on them at the last second strategy. So it's the same strategy for the Chimera. So a Chimera, even though it's got 666 all around, again, because of the wording, defense monsters need to be hit twice, you can do the same bait switch with the Chimera. By baiting it in 6, you can get 2 attacks at you, and then switch, and those 2 attacks become 2 hits, meaning the monster's going to die in the first hit, and you can sort of, well, you know, wipe out many monsters at once, especially if there's a multiple declared attack. So let's set up a little scenario, because that's a fantastic maneuver if you can pull it off. So let's do the scenario of, let's do this scenario. So my opponent has a Minotaur, Rainbow Serpent, and a Grillis. Alright? So in this scenario, they have got multiple different attacks. If I have my Chimera in evasive, alright, and we'll get the spell ready so you can see that as well. If I have my Chimera in evasive stance, I'm baiting them in. Now, in this scenario, it would make perfect sense. I have an evasive of 6. So, in this scenario, my opponent's got a 6, a 5, and another 6. So they can go, well, this is an easy fix. I have the monster advantage. I will use my Rainbow Serpent to attack twice, and then I will use my Minotaur for the 3rd attack. Now that that's been specified, and you can verify, you can go, oh, okay, so 2 from here and 1 from here. They say yes. You go, fantastic. Play this, and force your Chimera into defensive stance. Now, the first 2 Rainbow Serpent attacks are null and void because it's 5 to 6. The Rainbow Serpent kills itself on your wall. The Minotaur, and also it doesn't make sense because it's a 5, so it doesn't count. It automatically loses. The Minotaur comes in, gets the extra 6, but because there was not a first attack of 6, it was a first attack of 5, this Minotaur is eliminated, which means your opponent, if they wanted to kill this, would have to use the Grillis to get that last attack, killing both. So in that very rare situation, you can wipe out 3 monsters with the price of 1. It's all because you specified the attack. It also depends on how much they want this card dead, but that's the beauty of switching in defensive. If you're playing a defensive deck, that's what you want. You want your opponent sacrificing their monsters onto yours. Is there any good tips for closing chakras? Is there any good order to close them in, and what you should be looking for when you do close them? Very good question. So when it comes to closing chakras, if your opponent has a favorite chakra, so if a lot of their monsters are red, you would target the red chakra. But in certain situations when it comes to actually closing chakras, unless your opponent is leaning to one element or another, you can close either or. But there is a really good tips to closing chakras. So let's do an example. Your opponent has chakras, obviously, and you need to defeat them. Getting your opponent into a elemental lock is one of the best ways to eliminate multiple chakras. So let's set up an elemental lock thing. Okay. In this scenario, we're going to create what's called an elemental lock, and this is the best way to eliminate a lot of chakras at once. So if my opponent, this will take 2 turns to pull off. If you're lucky enough to pull off in one, I'll show you how to pull it off in 1 turn, but you're most likely going to do this maneuver in 2 turns. So I'll just get the spells I need to pull this off. So an elemental lock is this. You want to force your opponent into relying on a single element. So in this scenario, my opponent has 2 Oni, a Unicorn and a Grillis. Only the Grillis does not share the same weakness. The Oni and Unicorn are both weak to red. None of my cards are weak to red. This is perfect time for an elemental lock. So in my turn, what I would do is I would kill the Grillis, and now my opponent is in an elemental lock because they rely too heavily on red. But by systematically killing monsters to force your opponent into an elemental lock opens this door for you. So I kill the Grillis, now my opponent is reliant on red, so I change the element to red. All of these cards flip over, and now, because my Leviathan's attacked, I've got 3 monsters that are uncontested, and now all 3 can go in and wipe out 3 chakras. So forcing into an elemental lock is one very nifty little strategy. The second card that I have here is a spell force damage, and what this is for is to ensure that you get your elemental lock. So in this scenario here, the spell force damage is to make sure that I can pull this off. If my opponent was to play a card that forced my monsters into another stance, so for this example, my Leviathan is forced into a 6 and would kill himself by killing the Grillis, who's also a 6. That's what this is for. If my opponent switches me at the last second, I can play a spell force damage to make my Leviathan bigger, allowing me to kill this. Because you want to have this monster survive so that your elemental lock is not only successful, but you're building yourself up to having a monster advantage. So, very good question. The best way to wipe out chakras is by creating elemental locks. Besides from that, it's just old-fashioned whittling away and getting that monster advantage to topple as many as you can at once. We'll go... monster advantage is actually worth talking about again, because there's different ways you can get monster advantages and different ways to come back to a monster advantage. And this is also why buying booster decks is so important. So let's do a little bit of a switch up here and give my opponent a monster advantage. So I have 2 to my opponent's 5. This is a monster advantage of 2. Even at 3, they don't have a monster advantage because an element can come into play. One monster can be eliminated very easily. So you only have an elemental advantage when you have an excess of monsters. So in this scenario, 4 would be a monster advantage of 1, and 5 is a monster advantage of 2. I am at an extreme disadvantage in this situation, and I need to whittle my enemy down, but I also need to build up my own defenses. So the way that you can come back from this is a combination of magic and your monster's abilities. So let's set this up into different scenarios. One of the ways I could get a monster advantage is by playing Dismiss and Summon cards, because this allows me to summon without using my summon. So in my turn, I draw multiple cards. I can summon a Leviathan. I can then play a summon And then that allows me to summon another monster off the top of my deck, and now I'm only down by 1, and they no longer have the monster advantage. So it's a combination of just a single summon card can get you back from being down 2 to only being down none. So the monster advantage has disappeared. But you can combine that with, reverse time, a dismiss. The dismiss returns the last summoned monster. Yes, a monster that is summoned. So you can play this card first and have one of your opponent's previously summoned monsters returned, and then you can play your summon, again eliminating the monster advantage. 3 to 4, there is no monster advantage. Now you can combine these to turn the tide and get the monster advantage. So you can both dismiss, eliminating a monster, summon a monster, then summon another monster, and now your opponent is at 4 and you're at 5, and it's still your turn, so you're able to attack one of these monsters and eliminate and get the monster advantage, all in a single turn. Now, like I said, in most scenarios, these sort of things happen in 2 or more turns if you have to set it up. But having these 2 cards can take you from being at a disadvantage to either being even or at a higher advantage. Let's talk about combining the elemental lock and having the monster advantage. This would be classed more as an end game maneuver. So if your opponent had 4 chakras remaining, this is probably the best way to eliminate them. So let's do an elemental lock combined with a monster advantage. So again, to obtain these cards, you want to focus a lot on booster decks. So we'll do 8 over there. So this is the scenario, and this is a win game maneuver. I have my 4. Let's actually get rid of that and do that. So I'll go over the cards that I've picked in a moment. This is a bit of a, obviously this is a rigged hand, but this is to give you an idea of an actual monster advantage mixed with a elemental lockdown. So, my opponent has got 5 monsters to my 2, and I'm on the defensive here. I need to get away around these monsters, and I want to wipe out as many chakras as possible. So the best way to do this is to get my monster advantage. Alright, oops, probably don't need this. I just realised I put the card back that I needed. So, I'll put back the other card that I needed. That's fine, we can still do it with these. So, I want to get my monster advantage. It's my turn, and I draw, and I get a monster. So, I do my big play. I do my Leviathan. I do my dismiss first, and eliminate one of their monsters. I then play my Leviathan. So now you notice I'm 3 to 4. Alright, and then I play my summon. So that draws straight off my deck into my hand. So now we're 4 and 4. And then I use my force defense, and I force the Leviathan into a defensive stance, and then I eliminate it with my Leviathan, eliminating a monster from the field. So now it's 3 on 4, but this monster has attack, so now it's 3 on 3. But all of these monsters are weak to the same element, and I've created an elemental lock. So I can play this forcing all of these to go into out of phase, allowing me to jump in and eliminate 3 chakras, all in a single turn. Granted, like I said, you need to have those cards in your hand, but if you get booster decks, it's really not uncommon for that to happen. Forcing your opponent into an elemental lock means that no matter how many monsters they have, they've trapped themselves. And you can do this in several different ways. So let's continue down this theme and flip these back over. If my opponent favors an element, so in this scenario they favored the red element, if they played any more red favored monsters, so let's look for another red. Yep, so another unicorn. Even if they've got 4 unicorns and only in a Leviathan, I would still target the Leviathan over the others. Because by forcing my opponent to rely so much on one element, especially if I've got a card that allows me to get rid of that element, it means that I can get a serious attack in, especially from this situation. Having 2 monsters on the field and having summon and desummoned cards means that you can come back very quickly. Because with a summon card, you could end up having 2 monsters summoned per turn. If you had multiple summon cards, you could even do a much bigger flip over onto your opponent. But that requires a little bit more luck than it does anything else. Thank you, Debbie. Thank you. Hopefully this is hopefully this enlightens you and helps you with some of your little strategies. But I actually think that's a good ending point for the stream. I think next time I will focus more on deck building and the actual building of a defensive and aggressive deck. So if that interests you, by all means join in next time.